Hi, everyone. I'm Avi, and today we're going to talk about Chapter 3 of Mice and Men. I'm going to do a little summary and analysis, see if it can broaden our understanding. So in the evening after dinner and barley bucking in the fields, George and Slim return to the bunkhouse and sit together at the card table, while the rest of the laborers enjoy a horseshoe game outside. George thanks Slim for giving Lenny one of the new puppies, and says Lenny is probably so excited about his new pet that he'll want to sleep in the barn with the litter. Slim says he was happy to give Lenny a pup and remarks on how strong and hardworking Lenny is. Whereas, the boss and Curly are skeptical of the arrangement that George and Lenny have, Slim seems genuinely touched by their friendship. He likes Lenny and wants to help him feel welcome, suggesting that he, too, yearns for genuine connection amidst the hostility of life on the ranch, and in the greater context of the Great Depression. Slim remarks how strange it is to see two men traveling and working alongside each other like George and the cuckoo Lenny do. George remarks that he himself isn't so bright either, and that he and Lenny need each other. He explains that they were both born in Auburn. Lenny's Aunt Clara took him in when he was a baby and raised him as her own. After Aunt Clara died, George explains, Lenny started working with George, and they got kind of used to each other. George admits that he used to play jokes and pranks on Lenny, enjoying how Lenny's slowness made him seem goddamn smart. But after one of his pranks nearly resulted in Lenny's death, George resolved never to mess with him again. While it seems like Lenny is the one entirely dependent on George for support and survival, this passage makes it clear that George feels at times just as in need of Lenny as Lenny is of him. He's become Lenny's protector, but Lenny has also served to protect George from his darker impulses. Their relationship challenges societal ideas at the time about what makes someone weak and what makes someone strong. Next, George begins playing solitaire. He confesses to Slim that he doesn't want to get rid of Lenny and go around alone like most ranch workers, even though Lenny is a nuisance who often gets him in trouble. George begins telling them the story of what happened in Weed, the story of how Lenny got them run out of town after he seized a girl's soft dress. The girl told the police she'd been raped, and a band of local men tried to hunt Lenny down to punish him. Lenny and George hid out in an irrigation ditch until nightfall, at which point they scrammed and didn't look back. George insists Lenny would never have hurt the woman. He only wanted to touch her dress, just as he longs now to pet mice and puppies. Even though Lenny's preoccupation with stroking soft things seems odd to other people, George understands it, and he knows that Lenny truly doesn't have any other nefarious desires in mind, contrary to how things might look. George knows he needs to defend Lenny against people who misunderstand him and would seek to alienate, harm, or even kill him for his off-kilter obsessions. Next, Lenny comes into the bunkhouse, breathless with joy over his new puppy, and lies down on his bed. George tells him he's not allowed to have the puppy in the bunkhouse. Lenny insists he doesn't have the pup, but George approaches Lenny and wrestles the puppy out of his arms. George warns Lenny that he'll kill the puppy if he keeps it from his mother, and threatens to have Slim take the puppy away again if Lenny doesn't treat it right. Lenny takes the puppy back and hurries to return it to the barn. Slim remarks that Lenny is just like a child. George agrees and says that while like a child, Lenny doesn't want to do any harm. The problem is his immense strength. He doesn't know the limits of his strength or how to control it. We can see that protecting Lenny from others isn't the extent of George's duties to his friend. This passage makes it clear that George must also protect Lenny from himself. George knows that Lenny doesn't understand his own strength and might hurt himself or the things he loves if left to his own devices. Next, Candy comes into the bunkhouse, his old dog trailing behind him. Carlson, another laborer, comes to the bunkhouse, lamenting at having lost his horseshoes to the black stable hand. Carlson sniffs the air and urges Candy to get his stinking dog out of the bunkhouse. Candy says he's around the dog so much he doesn't notice the smell. Carlson suggests Candy put the dog out of his misery and shoot him. If Candy aims right at the back of the head, he says, the dog will not feel pain. Candy says he could never do such a thing. He's had the dog too long and is too used to him. Carlson retorts that Candy is being unkind to the dog by keeping him alive. Again, Candy's inability to imagine hurting his dog, in spite of the dog's own misery, mirrors George's reluctance to abandon or endanger Lenny, in spite of the difficulties Lenny creates for them both. Slim offers to give Candy a new pup from his bitch's litter. This is the term in the book. If Candy shoots his old dog. Candy says he's worried about hurting the dog. Carlson promises that if Candy lets him shoot the dog, he'll hit it right in the back of the head and make sure it feels no pain. Candy's face is tight and tense as he considers what he should do. This passage foreshadows and in a way ultimately dictates what will soon happen between George and Lenny. George will have to dispatch Lenny for both their sakes, and he will take a lesson from Carlson in the specifics of how to do it and the ethics behind it. Another laborer named Whit comes in and brings Slim a magazine to read. There's a letter inside by Bill Tanner, a laborer who used to work on the ranch. Carlson refuses to be distracted by Whit's remembrances of Tanner and continues hounding Candy about putting down his dog. Carlson offers to shoot it with his Luger. Though Candy suggests they wait until tomorrow, Carlson insists on doing the deed now. Candy at last relents, lying down on his bunk and staring at the ceiling. Carlson leads the dog outside, and Slim calls after him, reminding him to take a shovel. This passage continues the parallel between Candy's relationship with his dog and George's relationship with Lenny. Carlson's insistence that the deed be done now implies that while distractions may pop up, or George may try to avoid dealing with Lenny, he will eventually have to cut ties with Lenny in order to survive. The room falls silent, and Slim tries to make conversation to ease the morbid mood. He talks about his mule, who is in need of some tar on its hoof, and reminds Candy that he can have any puppy he wants. Candy does not reply. George asks if anyone wants to play some euchre, and Whit says he'll play. After he sits down at the table, though, he and George simply sit in silence. It is so quiet that the men can hear a scratching beneath the floorboards, a rat. Whit orders George to shuffle the cards and deal. As George does so, the men hear a single shot ring out. Everyone looks at Candy, who rolls over and faces the wall. Even though George tries to distract from the solemn mood in the bunkhouse and make some noise to drown out the noise of what's happening outside, this passage shows once again that there's no turning away from the truth of what has to be done in such dire circumstances. Next, the door opens and the stable hand peeks his head into the room. Slim greets the man as Crooks and asks him what the matter is. Crooks replies that he has some tar ready for Slim's mule's foot. Slim stands up and says he'll come take care of it. Crooks warns Slim that the big new guy is messing around with the puppies. George tells Slim to kick Lenny out of the barn if he's making trouble. Crooks is perhaps so worried about Lenny being in the barn because the stable is the one place where Crooks, the most marginalized and unfairly treated person on the ranch, feels in control. He doesn't want Lenny threatening his space or getting him in trouble, although Lenny's intentions are naively innocent. Later, after Slim and Crooks leave, Whit makes small talk with George about Curly's wife, remarking on how she got the eye going all the time. Whit admits that though there hasn't been any real trouble with her yet, it's clear to everyone that she can't keep away from guys, and Curly is anxious about it. George agrees that the girl sounds like trouble. Whit invites George to come with him and the other men to a whorehouse the following night, which is a Saturday. He assures him it's a clean place, where the prices are good and there's always fun to be had. George says he might tag along, but is planning on saving his money so that he and Lenny can buy some land. Whit clearly loves drama and women. Though George tells Whit he's trying to save money, focus on the future, and ignore distractions like whorehouses and billiard halls, Whit represents the temptation that threatens to derail George and Lenny's plans. Next, Lenny and Carlson come into the bunkhouse together. Lenny gets into bed and Carlson begins cleaning his pistol. Curly bursts in asking for his wife. Whit says she hasn't come by. Curly looks around the room and asks where Slim is. George says he's at the barn tending to his mule's hoof. Curly blusters away. Whit says he hopes Curly won't go after Slim, but at the same time wouldn't put it past him. Whit and Carlson decide to go over to the barn and see if the two men will fight one another. Whit and Carlson are just as quick to suspicion and anger as Curly. They want to see blood. Someone else getting beat up and scapegoated means that they are safe in the dog-eat-dog world of the ranch for a little while longer. So George asks Lenny why he's come back from the barn, and Lenny says Slim told him that petting the puppies too much wouldn't be good for them. George asks if Curly's wife went by the barn, and Lenny says she didn't. George again reminds Lenny to stay out of trouble and stay out of any fights he does happen to hear about or witness. George remarks on how much trouble a tart can make and tells Lenny that one of their old friends from grammar school, Andy Cushman, is in prison now on account of a tart. George is just as willing as the other men on the ranch to make a scapegoat out of Curly's wife, rather than consider why the men on the ranch are unable to control themselves around her. It's clear that as the only woman on the ranch, she is marginalized and judged as being promiscuous merely because she wants attention. Lenny asks George how long it will be until they get their piece of land. George says he doesn't know. He's heard of a place, but even though it's relatively cheap, they still have a lot of saving to do. Lenny asks George to tell him about the place. George protests that he just told Lenny about it last night, but Lenny asks to hear about it again. George relents and again tells Lenny the romantic story about the lush, fertile farm they'll live on. They'll plant alfalfa, harvest an orchard, and raise rabbits. As George goes deeper and deeper into detail about the imagined place, he gets lost in his own reverie. Even though George uses his stories about the hypothetical farm he and Lenny will move to largely placate and distract Lenny, he can't help believing that one day they'll come true. He's usually able to resist getting too swept up in his own stories, such as when he pulled himself out of the reverie back at the river. But tonight, he needs the fantasy just as much as Lenny does. Lenny continues focusing intensely on the fantasy of raising and petting as many rabbits as he wants. Both Lenny and George are so lost in their reverie that when Candy speaks, they both jump. Candy asks if there really is a place like the one George is describing. George insists there is, and that it could be his for $600. Candy states that he has $300 saved up from the accident that took his hand and would be happy to go in with George and Lenny on the property. In exchange, he says he'd cook 10 chickens and work in the garden. Now, George and Lenny have been alone in their fantasy for so long that when a third person expresses interest in joining them, it's destabilizing. It makes the fantasy more real, which is just as frightening as it is motivating and exciting, since Candy's expectations and investment will force George and Lenny to make concrete plans rather than continuing to aimlessly dream. George is skeptical of Candy's offer and says he'd always conceived himself and Lenny working the farm on their own. Still, as he begins doing the math, he realizes that he and Lenny will be able to get their place sooner with Candy's contribution. George becomes excited and emotional. He continues daydreaming aloud, lost in thoughts of being able to be the master of his own destiny and do whatever he wants. As the other men's voices can be heard approaching the bunkhouse, George asks Lenny and Candy to keep their plan a secret. Candy agrees and solemnly remarks that he should have been the one to shoot his own dog. George maybe never let himself really believe the farm was something he and Lenny could ever achieve. But now, with Candy on their side, George lets himself indulge in the dream a little more seriously for the first time in his life. In spite of George and Lenny's excitement, Candy remains disturbed by what he's done to his dog, foreshadowing that George and Lenny will still have to face unpleasantness and strife, even in the face of their new lease on life. Slim, Curly, Carlson, and Whit all enter the bunkhouse next. Slim and Curly are arguing. Slim says he's sick of Curly constantly asking him about his own wife's whereabouts. Carlson urges Curly to get control of his wife before he has trouble on his hands. Curly threatens to fight Carlson, but Carlson accuses Curly of being yella. As tensions between the three men escalate, George realizes with a horror that Lenny is smiling and laughing, still lost in his thoughts of their little plot of land. Curly notices Lenny's smile and challenges him to a fight. As Curly begins hitting Lenny, Lenny keeps his hands at his sides, paralyzed with fear and unwilling to even defend himself. Here we can see that even when he's provoked, Lenny refuses to fight back. He is the opposite of Curly in every way, but most noticeably in terms of his temperament. Lenny could crush Curly, but his gentle demeanor, fear of trouble, and childlike mindset mean that he tries to avoid violence at any cost. Curly, on the other hand, has no problem victimizing and scapegoating Lenny in order to release his own frustrations. George, angered by Curly's attack on the vulnerable Lenny, urges Lenny to fight back. As Curly reaches a fist back and swings at Lenny, Lenny catches Curly's fist in one of his hands and begins crushing it. Curly starts crying in pain, but Lenny doesn't let go until George tells him to. Slim and Carlson stand over Curly and remark that they need to get him to the doctor. It hardly looks like he has a single bone left in his hand intact. Lenny cries, stating that he didn't want to hurt Curly. Slim urges Curly to tell the boss, when asked what happened to his hand, that he got it caught in a machine. Slim warns Curly that there will be consequences if he tells the truth. Curly promises he won't try to get Lenny or George fired. This passage shows that in spite of Lenny's reluctance to use it, he is in possession of immense physical strength. When he focuses it on something, he becomes powerful, even dangerous. Even in the face of this realization, the other men remain on Lenny's side and threaten Curly with further pain and retaliation if he tries to make things worse for the poor Lenny. Finally, Carlson takes Curly away to go to the doctor in town. George tells Lenny to wash his bloody face. Lenny asks George if he's in trouble and whether he'll still be allowed to tend the rabbits. George assures Lenny that he's done nothing wrong. This passage shows how truly reluctant Lenny is to resort to violence of any kind for fear of upsetting George, or revealing that he is in fact too strong and powerful to gently tend rabbits. Join me next time for chapter 4 of Mice and Men. Things are really heating up in the narrative. We've got just 3 chapters left till we reach the end. Thanks, everyone.